Today we will be discussing uncovering Afghanistan's relationship with its eastern and northeastern neighbors, as well as southern neighbor, which includes Pakistan, India, and China, and India. Sorry, we will be discussing the various aspects of this relationship. I must say that the idea of this project started a year ago when we saw with President Biden coming to office the uncertainties and changes that would come on the relationship and the global and regional environment when it comes to Afghanistan. So I and Magdalena initiated the talk and discussion and to see what we could do to capture the trends and the patterns that will bring changes to Afghanistan's relationship with its regional as well as global environment. Now, we did not predict the collapse, I must say, but we did foresee the change. And we also came up with this idea that this should be done by Afghan researchers, and it should be a way to look at it from the Afghan perspectives, because we see lots of policy papers written by different international experts. So we took the route that we will let Afghans to explain it from their lens, the relationship that Afghanistan is having with its neighbors, especially the security aspect of the relationship. Now, these were carried out by very capable and very young researchers, Afghan researchers and authors. And I would like to thank some of you, almost all of you actually, for agreeing to be interviewed, for supporting them, for being here, and also during the interviews and others through the research process that you engaged with us. So the product of this research, of this project or joint effort, was the 6 policy briefs, as well as another research product, which we did not publish, but hopefully at another time. Therefore, today we are here to release the second batch of those policy briefs. I would like to thank everybody for being with us here. We were honored to partner with FES, as well as with others who have helped us through the research. IWPS is a very local Afghan institution. We're totally Afghanized, and we give that local perspective into things. And we have presence still. We work in Afghanistan, and our researchers are based in Afghanistan. And I would like to thank them that in spite of a lot of difficulties, after the collapse, they had their courage and momentum to basically finish off these research papers and carry out their program. So thank you for being with us. Over to you, Magdalena.
Thank you so much, Tamim. Thank you and welcome everyone. Also from FES, which is a German private organization that works in Kabul since 2002. And I think for us, it's especially important what Tamim also said in the past years. We wanted to continue on regional dialogues and putting Afghans at the center of these discourses, and not only as the object of the discussions, and also support and empower where possible local capacities, as IWPS, I think, provides a great opportunity for younger and also senior, obviously, Afghan experts. And I think this seminar is one of our exercises to do that, to not have them talk to themselves, but bring them in direct contact on an equal level with international scholars to get, insights that we wouldn't have otherwise, and also obviously strengthen Afghan voices in a key discourse. So thank you, Tamim. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you're registered for this webinar, please feel free to comment, ask questions in the Q&A function. If you join us by watching on Facebook or Twitter, use the comment function or DM. We will collect questions, obviously, and make sure to keep this as interactive as possible. We do have quite an impressive panel. Tamim already told you that this is the second part of an effort that we started yesterday, and that is basically go one time around Afghanistan and to actually look at relationships that we knew before a bit. I think it's no surprise that international relations of Afghanistan are key for the survival of the state and for state-society relations. So we wanted, as Tamim said, we always wanted to do something on Afghanistan and the neighbors, especially under the question whether the neighbors would be able and willing to fill a vacuum when the US was leaving, or what would a vacuum mean for them. But as Tamim also said, in the middle of this project, the main actor of this endeavor, the Afghan foreign policy apparatus, kind of collapsed under the hands of our researchers. So the key question is now, if we have a new rulers in town, which I think the Taliban obviously are, how would they conduct actually relationships with the neighbors, being under the same, well, external conditions, the dependence of Afghanistan on the outside world, but also the having to build up the state and inheriting a difficult situation. And obviously, if you follow the news, you know that many of the panels held on Afghanistan these days are obviously addressing the humanitarian crisis. And even this makes it even more important from our side to really discuss with the speakers the question how the toxic isolation that Afghanistan is going through these days, how that can be actually overcome, and could the Taliban be a partner from it? Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Tamim already mentioned that we have our three authors of the briefs that we published yesterday and will continue to publish in the past days, the lead authors of these policy briefs, a great team of researchers, Mariam Jami, Alamuddin Rizwan, and Rajab Tayyib with us, who will introduce part of their research and also be with us, of course, through the discussion. And then we have two very distinguished international speakers that cover, I think, the most prominent neighbors in the discussion about Afghanistan in the southern region. That is Ambassador Rakesh Sood. He's a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He is a former diplomat, a very distinguished columnist and writer. He was previously the special envoy for disarmament and non-proliferation, but very interesting for us, he served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan in the past, but was also posted to India's High Commission in Islamabad. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. We also have with us Dr. Mariha Afzal, who got up really early. Thank you so much. She joins us this morning from Brookings, from Washington, D.C., where she is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Program. Previously, David Rubenstein, fellow at the same institution. And I think everybody who follows the discussion on Afghanistan and Pakistan knows Mariha because she's a very distinguished expert on both U.S. policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also bilateral relations of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Pakistani politics, which we, I think, certainly want to hear more about. We will have at a later stage another speaker with us. Joining from Islamabad is Ms. Amin Khan, who's the director of the Center for Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa at the Institute for Strategic Studies in Islamabad. She will join us later. We will now hear three introductory remarks, which will bring us, I think, to the track of our discussion. We will hear about how neighboring states have adapted to the disruptions since August 15th. Obviously, we hear about historical relations, and we all want to know, of course, where's the potential for cooperation in the future, or do we see, especially with some neighbors, not only protracted conflict with the Taliban, but also a return of proxy conflicts that I think are also a great concern. Without further ado, I would now give the floor to Ms. Mariam Jami, who will tell us a bit about the Chinese policies in Afghanistan and Afghanistan-China relations in this new period of politics. Mariam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Kirchner. Firstly, I would like to welcome all of our distinguished speakers, our participants, and the audience. So there are much to be mentioned on the China, Pakistan, and India triangle, and I want to kick off with China. Well, China's engagement in Afghanistan has been mostly an economic one. I mean, China has invested in important projects in Afghanistan, like Mes Ainak project in Logar province, Amu Darya Basin project, and also some railway initiatives in Afghanistan. However, in the recent years, China had also attempted to engage in some political and military initiatives or activities regarding Afghanistan. As such, in 2018, Beijing has attempted to provide some military training for the former Afghan security sector, and Beijing had also initiated the trilateral foreign ministers dialogue involving the foreign ministers of Afghanistan, China, and Pakistan. So what will be expected from China in the post-2021 context? Well, China would seek to secure its interests in Afghanistan. As I said before, it has important economic projects in Afghanistan, and to be able to reaffirm those projects or plans, China needs a stable Afghanistan. But not only to continue its economic projects, this stability is also needed for China to make sure that Afghanistan would not become a productive platform for the terrorism in the region, which would potentially mobilize the Uyghur militias in the Xinjiang province of China. And also, China's relations with Afghanistan, particularly with the Taliban, would also affect India and Pakistan's policies. As such, China and Pakistan are the so-called Iron Brothers, and their policies align with regard to Afghanistan, mostly aligns. However, the one point of tension between these two countries is now the issue of terrorism and the most repeated allegations that Pakistan is somehow backing terrorism or separatism. So if the Pakistan chooses to abandon these or chooses to conform to this promise of fighting the terrorism, it would also make the Taliban change their mind and change their policies on this issue. So by contrast, India is also a mutual adversary of these countries. I mean, the mutual adversary of China and Pakistan, because India has the border disputes with both China and Himalayas, and also with Pakistan in Jammu and Kashmir. And so the friendly relations of the Taliban with China and Pakistan would also make things complicated for India as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think we heard a couple of buzzwords that I think will continue to be with us through the session. And I think the most important sentence that I also picked up, and you can, when you read the briefs, which I really recommend, the theme of China needs stability, but at the same time, the conflict between China and India, well, it's more latent. The US, these are all factors that are relevant also for the neighbor. Ambassador, so if you would continue and pick up where Mariam Jan started, how would you describe the situation for India as it plays out right now?
Well, let me first of all say that I think that while China has made certain promises about investment, to the best of my knowledge, there has not been any investment in Mes Ainak or the railway project. I think Tamim can probably, given his last position, can tell us if there has actually been any real investment in any of these major infrastructure projects like Mes Ainak or the railways, or for that matter, the oil gas exploration that is supposed to, I mean, I don't know if China has a license or it was merely an MOU. So therefore, I would say that China needs stability more for political reasons and the economic development. I mean, these are, first of all, railways, Mezainak, because after all, when you do copper mining, you need to either move the ore or you need to do some smelting there and so on. You need electricity. I mean, this is huge. And then how do you transport that stuff? Where do you take it out from? So these are long gestation projects. And I am somewhat skeptical about, notwithstanding the fact that the Chinese implement projects very efficiently and all the rest of it. I mean, granted all that, but I still think that it will be a long time before we see some of these major projects seeing the light of day. But I do agree with Mariam when she says that China very much would like stability in Afghanistan, but there are political reasons for that stability. Because instability in Afghanistan would not only impact Pakistan, but it would also impact the Central Asian countries. And the Chinese investments in Pakistan are very crucial for China. The CPEC project and all the rest of it. All the projects under CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And Central Asian countries are also extremely important for China, given its linkages of the Belt and Road and all the rest of it. So I would say that, that is critical. And even in terms of trade, actually, if you look at it, while China is perhaps the Chinese imports to Afghanistan, or Afghan imports of Chinese products are, they are the third largest after Iran and after Pakistan. But it's a total of just about slightly over $1 billion, which is, as far as China's foreign trade is concerned, that is like a rounding off error. And there are no Afghan exports to China. If you look at the Afghan exports, limited though they are, the Afghan exports largely are to India and to Pakistan. These are the two countries that account for something like more than 70% of Afghanistan's exports. And then, of course, there are very small amounts of exports to other countries like Turkey and Iran, UAE, and so on, and some of the Central Asian countries, because the primary items that are exported from Afghanistan are essentially agricultural products. And the agricultural products account for something like $700 million of exports out of something like $870 million of exports. These are the 2019 figures. And the rest is made up of things like carpets and minerals and so on, because minerals require heavy investments. So that is what, now coming to where I see India. See, I think the Indian relationship with Afghanistan obviously goes back centuries because of historical reasons. Before 1947, the Indian subcontinent shared a border. So there are lots of historical evidences that go back literally to more than 2,000 years in terms of, whether it was the Kushan kings or whether it was, you find references to Bagram, you find references to Kapisa, you find references to Kandahar and all the rest of it, because it was all, there were linkages, and you find the Bamiyan Buddhas, the part of the Silk Route, so all that is very much there. And then, of course, there comes a discontinuity with 1947 because India and Afghanistan no longer share a border. So that is the first element of discontinuity. The point I'm trying to make is that while at a people-to-people level, there has been a continuity in the relationship over centuries, literally centuries. At a government-to-government level, there have been periods of discontinuity. So I would say 1947 would mark the first, in a sense, a discontinuity because you're no longer neighbors. Then I would say that the second discontinuity happens largely when when India closes down its embassy. You know, after the fall of the Najibullah government, when you have the Mujahideen coming in 1992, after a short while, there is a lot of internal fighting between the Mujahideen leaders. And as a result, the law and order situation starts deteriorating, warlordism takes over, and so on. And gradually, we end up reducing our diplomatic presence. And then finally, just as the Taliban are approaching Kabul, we close down our embassy. And then we have no diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. And that is the time when India, we have no contact with the Taliban. In fact, the only contact we have with the Taliban is not a particularly happy one when in 1999, there is a flight out of Kathmandu coming to Delhi, which gets hijacked. And after detours in Pakistan and Dubai and so on, ends up in Kandahar. And India has to send a negotiating team and doesn't turn out very well. And that remains, so that also remains as part of the negative baggage, as it were, as far as the Taliban are concerned. And so during that period, actually, we end up more with Russia and Iran supporting the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. So if at all there is a discontinuity in that sense with the government to government, with the regime to regime relationship. See, so that is another discontinuity here. Then we go back into Afghanistan once the Taliban are ousted. And interestingly, what has happened in this process is that traditionally, if we go back historically, our linkages at a people-to-people level are much closer with the Pashtun community, have traditionally been closer to the Pashtun community. You find the Pashtuns' major influence in our film industry, for example, which is, as you know, a very popular source of spreading Indian movies all around the world, including in Afghanistan. And in literature, I mean, many people today don't remember that India's first Nobel laureate, Tagore, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature more than 100 years ago. One of his most well-known stories is Kabuliwala, you know, the old Pashtun traders, which was made into a film at least 3 times and has won numerous awards, national and international. And is, so the idea that the Pashtun as a character has been part of the literary folklore, and that was the community with which traditionally we had, because after all, when India and Pakistan, when it was one Indian subcontinent, you had the Pashtuns, which is now NWFP or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, when that was India. So, you know, the Pashtun community straddled the Durand line. So it was quite understandable. However, during the Taliban period, we ended up working with the Northern Alliance, which was essentially dominated more by Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and so on. And so we ended up engaging far more with them, obviously. And so when we went back in 2002 and re-established the embassy in 2002, we found that we, while we were rediscovering our connect with the moderate Pashtuns who now were in the Islamic Republic and positions of authority, but we also had the advantage of having linkages with the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Hazaras because of the 5-6 years of our association with the Northern Alliance. And that is something that helped us in developing our economic assistance program. And while it is one thing to say that India has, spent about $3 billion on economic cooperation, assistance, etc., etc. But actually, if you look at it, unlike traditional donors, because India is not a traditional donor. In fact, most of our economic cooperation activity has been limited to neighboring countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and so on, and a little bit in African countries. We don't have an aid agency. So when we say 3 billion, it means 3 billion actually delivered on the ground. Mm-hmm. Whereas when a World Bank figure of 3 billion comes in, the actual delivery is about 20% on the ground. So that is why the impact of the Indian assistance, because not even 1 cent of that 3 billion goes into administrative costs or into salaries of Indian experts or anything. Those are paid separately out of the Indian government's budgets and not out of the money that is committed to, let us say we are building a road and there is an Indian company that is contracted to build that road. The salaries of the Indian engineers who are going to be deployed there are not going to come out of the $20 million that are allocated for building the road. That's the key difference. And that is what made a difference. So now, while we had developed this, now we have come to a second discontinuity. Because again, after 20 years, we have closed our embassy there. And so that, I think, at the same time, at a people-to-people level, there is a relationship that continues, because that relationship is marked by much greater continuity as compared to the regime to regime. In that sense, there is a stark difference. And I think that is something which the government today is, because of the fact that we were probably the only people who not only said that we believed in an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process. I think we actually believed in it and implemented it. So we had zero contacts with the Taliban, whereas many of the other countries kept parroting the line of Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, but in the process, completely excluded the government in Afghanistan and proceeded on their own linkages with the Taliban. And for whatever reason, there were some of us who felt that what we were following was a very short-sighted policy, and I was among them. And the result of that is that when the Taliban walked into Kabul on 15th of August, and the Americans were leaving and everybody else was leaving, we really had no choice. And also, given the fact that the Haqqani network was a very integral part of the Taliban. After all, Sirajuddin Haqqani is the number 2. And we know that the Haqqanis have orchestrated, have been directly involved in some of the worst terrorist attacks on Indian embassy in Kabul, where Indian doctors have been staying guest houses, on some of the engineers who have been beheaded. I mean, we have Indian engineers who've been working in projects in other areas of Afghanistan and who were kidnapped or beheaded and so on. So given the fact and these close linkages between the Haqqanis and the inter-services ISI, the Pakistani intelligence, obviously left the government with zero choice but to close down the embassy. And that is where we are. And I think it will take some time before India decides to go and reopen its embassy. But at the same time, because of the people-to-people continuity, we've offered 50,000 tons of food aid and essential medicines. And Pakistan has now agreed that they can be transported once the modalities are worked out. So I guess the modalities still have to be worked out. Having dealt with some of these issues in the past, I don't want to take up more time, but maybe offline I can tell you some stories about our food aid in the past to Afghanistan, which, and the difficulties of how long it took. So, but I'm sure, but if the modalities get worked out and this assistance goes through, and if more is needed, I'm sure at a humanitarian level, India will certainly be forthcoming with that assistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sood. I think there was a really rich ride, as we can see from your very impressive background through the history, but also I think we'll later pick certainly up on the question of discontinuity and what like a return of a political approach could actually look like, as the authors in their brief were quite bold in making recommendations for the continuity or like a start from zero in these kind of connections with the Taliban, and I'm happy to address that in the Q&As. And now I would hand over to Dr. Afzal. Pakistan was already mentioned directly and indirectly by the previous speakers, and I think as like one of the at least initial winners of the Doha process and the developments in the last months, it would be quite interesting to see how the picture has changed or what the future engagement would also look like. Mariha, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from Washington. Thanks so much for holding this discussion. Thanks to Magdalena and Tamim for the invitation to speak, and congratulations to the authors for your policy briefs. To write them at this time and to take an analytical approach to the question of Afghanistan's relationship with obviously three very important countries in the region. I think it's really commendable. So again, congratulations. I will touch upon sort of three aspects that relate to this discussion: Pakistan and sort of the contours in some ways of the relationship looking ahead. Also, US policy towards Afghanistan, which remains critical, and the China question and how it relates to Pakistan as well. And that's been addressed, I think admirably already by Mariam and Ambassador Sood, but I'll just touch upon where I think the China question is. So let me actually start with the point on China, which is that China's main interest in Afghanistan's stability and security really has to do, I think, with two aspects. One is CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is $62 billion worth of investments in Pakistan. And in that, China wants to make sure that Afghanistan does not become a staging ground for terrorist attacks on both Chinese investments in Pakistan, so the economic investments, as well as Chinese targets, so Chinese workers who are working on these investments. And we have seen some aspect of that already happening in terms of the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, targeting these, both Chinese investments and Chinese workers. So that's, I think, China's main concern with Afghanistan's security and stability. And then the second, of course, is the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the threat to the Chinese mainland that China perceives could come from an unstable and insecure Afghanistan. I think until China has assurances of stability and security in Afghanistan, it's going to be hesitant to put more stock into its own economic investments in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. So really, it's concerns have to do more with Pakistan in some ways, and Afghanistan's impact on Pakistan rather than Afghanistan, and its own economic investments in Afghanistan. So that's my first point. The second point I'll mention is on Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban is well known, and many argued that this could be seen as a victory, the Taliban's rise as a victory for Pakistan. It's a very problematic victory. I think those points have been made over the months, but I'll just reiterate some sort of contours of the problems that come with that. The first is, concerns that Pakistan has about its own security. And really it has to do with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the fact that the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan maintains very close ties with the Afghan Taliban, is emboldened by the Afghan Taliban's rise. Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan militants were released in the days leading up to the fall of Kabul, as the Taliban were going around taking over the country, and the resurgence of the TTP is something we've seen since last year. It started attacking security forces in Pakistan in the weeks after, at sort of a pace that exceeded attacks even in the last year. And what is now the case is that Pakistan is in talks with the TTP. What we know about these talks is that there might be amnesty for TTP militants who lay down arms if they agree to let go of sort of their fight against the Pakistani state, their insurgency against the Pakistani state. It is extremely unclear whether any kind of peace agreement will come to pass. We know that there have been attempts to talk to the TTP in the past; they have not worked. But right now, there is reportedly a ceasefire under effect between the Pakistani government and the TTP. The Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, have reportedly been the mediators, though they've officially denied it. So it hasn't apparently been in an official capacity. The repercussions of this for Pakistan are manifold. It doesn't really just have to do with the fact that violence may cease, but this has an effect on both militant and jihadist groups in the region who will take the TTP basically, if a peace deal comes to pass, getting off scot-free as assurance that they can also engage in terror against the Pakistani state and get off scot-free, because of sort of the milieu. So this is a problem. This is a worry for Pakistan. I think it affects the Afghan Taliban's rise in Afghanistan, affects Pakistan's relationships with the rest of the world. It has affected its relationship with the United States. It's kind of put it in a strange state where the US still needs Pakistan for a couple of things, including over-the-horizon counterterrorism, including airlines of control, including putting pressure on the Taliban to engage in a more inclusive form of government, to give some concessions on women's rights. So the US still needs Pakistan for all of this. I think the US also wants to make sure that Pakistan does not unilaterally recognize the Taliban regime. Pakistan has so far not done that. But at the same time, it has unquestionably strained the relationship between the US and Pakistan, the rise of the Taliban. Yet Pakistan still plays a role in convening, countries. The Troika Plus is one forum. The Troika Plus is the US, Pakistan, China, and Russia, which have been meeting, now for a while, sort of during the Doha process, but also met in Islamabad just last month. And that is a forum that puts out sort of statements basically saying, look, we want the Taliban to be inclusive. We want them to, basically ensure equal rights for women and girls and so on. And there's going to be another meeting of that forum soon. So Pakistan still plays a role in that forum. It notably did not attend the NSA level talks that India held around the same time last month. And so that is an indication that Pakistan wants, its position to sort of be dominant when it comes to Afghanistan, and India's to play less of a role. So that's sort of the Pakistan front. The one thing I will say about US policy towards Afghanistan is that while the region is critically important, US policy towards Afghanistan is still the most important factor here, the fact that we have $1 trillion in frozen assets in the US of the Afghan government. And the consensus that is emerging is that while humanitarian aid, and humanitarian aid has been allowed, while humanitarian aid can make a difference, it will not be enough to stave off the humanitarian catastrophe that is, set to unfold in Afghanistan if these funds remain frozen. And so the question then is, there have been, I think, commendable attempts made by the World Bank, the UN, to try to find creative ways to get money to, Afghan public health officials, to trying to figure out how to pay teachers and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the banking system is not functioning because of these frozen assets. And sanctions also play a role. How can the US sort of make a difference to stave off this catastrophe? The problem is that politically, domestically in the US, it is unpalatable to engage with the Taliban regime, to basically let go of sanctions, to unfreeze assets, because that is the one tool that the US said that they had, that the US had in order to get the Taliban to moderate. So there are political domestic considerations that the Biden administration is facing. At the same time, of course, time is of the essence, and there is a humanitarian catastrophe about to unfold in Afghanistan. And I think that fundamental dilemma, the region is critically important, but that fundamental dilemma will sort of shape the next part of Afghanistan's future.
Thank you very much, Mariha. I would now move back to our Afghan researchers and ask Alamuddin Rizwan, who's the lead author for our briefs on India and Pakistan, and reflect not only a bit on what previous speakers said, but also on the actual positions, or as they're forming the positions of the Taliban government towards these neighbors, then the bad relations that were reflected with Ambassador Sood on the discontinuities. What is the position on the Taliban? What kind of engagement on their end is wanted from India, maybe also from China, but from Pakistan? What can you tell us from like the Afghan side? What would you recommend even to the neighbors how to engage in Afghanistan in the future? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And it's good to see you all, and thank you for joining this event and for your support. To begin with, after the collapse of the Afghan government, one of the main concerning issue to the region, countries, and to the international community has been the threat of terrorism emerging from Afghanistan. And there is no doubt that Afghanistan has been one of the major factors in the region, country's foreign policy, especially for India, Pakistan, and China. But tensions between these countries have largely affected their relations with Afghanistan, especially India and Pakistan tensions over Kashmir region. In the past 2 decades, specifically, India have heavily invested in Afghanistan and pursued a soft power strategy, and until recently, it could prevent Pakistan from expanding its regional influence and using Afghanistan to connect with Central Asian countries. On the other hand, we have been witness that Pakistan experienced fragile relations with the previous government in Afghanistan. And although Pakistan wanted a friendly government in Afghanistan, friendly relations, and to somehow the military cooperation with the government of Afghanistan, it did not happen to a great extent. After the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, India's role has been shattered, and it has no longer direct access to the country. And we know that India has been a strong backer of the US mission in Afghanistan, and it opposed their withdrawal from Afghanistan because it knew that if US and NATO withdraw from Afghanistan, it would enable its adversaries such as Pakistan and China to step in and use the vacuum left by them for their own benefits. And we can say that, considering their, as Ambassador said, their past history, it's not easy for India to start engaging with the Taliban who are running or ruling Afghanistan right now. In terms of Pakistan and China, we can say they have a common position concerning the Taliban, and they are somewhat open to cooperating with them. And we have been witness that there have been many high-level meetings between the delegations of these countries with the Taliban, and they jointly advocate for humanitarian assistance and for releasing the assets of Afghanistan to the international stages. And they will make a joint decision on the recognition of the future government of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And in terms of their current policy, I can say India is waiting to see what Taliban how the Taliban will make their foreign policy, and will they be committed on social development and democratic values achieved in 2 decades, and also whether they will assure counter terrorism activities or measures in Afghanistan. And the same goes with Pakistan. They are waiting to see how the Taliban consolidate their power, and they also require the Taliban to to fulfill their pledges for an inclusive government and to honor human rights, women's rights, and also counter-terrorism measures. I think this is all that I can say for these 2 countries' policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I give the mic back to Ambassador Sood, who also wants to, I think, make a few points on previous speakers and the papers as well, just an encouragement on our participants to also use the Q&A function or the chat. And one question that was raised in the Facebook Live, and I would pass it on to you, Ambassador, it was raised in German, so I will casually translate it. It said something like, Afghanistan is always like, well, a play ball of the world powers. The only ally that Afghanistan ever had, the true friend, is India. And I wanted to ask you, the dilemma that Maria mentioned between helping the Afghan people and feeling the commitment to basically not starve off the people there, but at the same time have a firm position towards the Taliban and expect changes in behavior. Is that something that India faces as well? Or do you think it's further out and when we need years before India can even think of engaging with the Taliban? Over to you.
Thank you. I particularly wanted to come back to some of the points that Rizwan made just now. And I think these are also points that are there in the paper that you've circulated. And I think it is important to correct certain sort of widespread misperceptions here. For example, I think Rizwan mentioned the fact that Indian policies in Afghanistan were characterized and driven by the aim of countering Pakistan's influence and minimizing its political involvement. And he mentioned that just now. And he also added that India's policies have prevented Pakistan from expanding its influence or using Afghanistan as a bridge to connect to Central Asia. I mean, I disagree very strongly with this kind of perception because it's a very convenient way. It's a popular Western convenient myth that Afghanistan, there is the India-Pakistan rivalry. When India went back after having closed its embassy, the fact is that we did not get involved with the security sector largely on account of Pakistan's concerns related to us through the Americans. The Americans were acutely sensitive to Pakistan's concerns because of the ground lanes of communication, the airlines of communication and all that. And so therefore, we were quite happy to focus exclusively on economic work, whether it was humanitarian assistance, whether it was infrastructure development, and whether it was human resource development. As I mentioned earlier to the listeners, there has been a strong degree of continuity. And while our traditional connections were with the Pashtun community, during the Taliban years, we got somewhat distanced from the Pashtun community because the Taliban was largely, I'm not saying that all Pashtuns are Taliban, but yes, during the 1990s, the vast majority of the Taliban were all Pashtuns. The reverse was not necessarily true, but because they were the ruling people, so ruling group, we got distanced from them. Instead, we started connecting far more with the Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras, with whom traditionally we had had relatively little contact. So when we went back in, the objective was very simply that we will have a relationship across all boundaries. We, unlike Pakistan, which seeks a friendly government in Kabul, we don't play favorites in Afghanistan. We will work with any government in Kabul that seeks to develop Afghanistan, to bring about economic development across the board for all Afghans. And that is what we understand by an inclusive government. So this idea that our approach was linked to negating Pakistan's influence is a completely wrong approach. On the contrary, this is very much a Pakistan's approach. And there is a reason for this. And I must make that clear because I think it is important to reflect this point correctly in the paper that you have on India, which is that because Pakistan and India are locked in this hostile relationship, Pakistan has looked at Afghanistan as part of its, strategic depth or whatever it is. And therefore, and that is one of the reasons that because it looks at Afghanistan through its India prism, it leads to a suspicious relation because it is always interested in trying to bring about a friendly government in Kabul. I mean, as far as India is concerned, any government in Kabul that is going to work towards the development of all Afghans, all Afghan communities, is a government with which we will be ready to work with because we think that that government will find us a willing development partner. That is, I think, one of the key differences. There were a couple of other points. And I mean, there is another point which he mentions in the paper, which is that India-Pakistan conflict is rooted in Kashmir. I think that that history is long over. Today, I'm willing to bet that even if by some magical wand we are able to resolve Kashmir, the India-Pakistan conflict will continue because it has become a far deeper kind of an issue between India and Pakistan. I've written extensively about it. I don't want to go into it because that is not the main theme. There are a couple of other things. I mean, there is also a reference in the paper about ITBP, Indo-Tibet Border Police Commandos. Indo-Tibet Border Police is a paramilitary force. It's like, they were deployed to protect the embassy. When I was the ambassador there, they provided the guards at the embassy. They were the escorts, and they were also there to guard some of the projects. They are not commandos. I think there is a factual mistake in terms of it's a paramilitary organization. It is an armed police organization as distinct from the civilian police that is not armed. And finally, we don't have a vast volume of trade with Central Asia. I think the phrase used is that there is a vast volume of trade. The total amount of trade that India has with Central Asia is $2 billion with all the Central Asian countries put together, which is nothing compared to $800 billion of our foreign trade, which is what roughly our annual figures are. So, and I doubt that we will have very large amounts of trade relationship with Central Asia. So I think that some of these issues are relevant. And again, I think the other point that he mentioned, that was mentioned, was that India was opposed to the US withdrawal. Well, I can tell you, we certainly had reservations because, as I have written repeatedly and spoken repeatedly, the return of the Taliban to me was not at all a surprise. I think the cards were on the table because for anybody could see it. This time, the process of legitimization of the Taliban had been in the works for a decade. After all, when the Taliban opened an international office in Doha, when the Taliban started attending peace conferences and peace processes in different capitals in the world, I mean, this is a gradual process of legitimization. Yes, then comes the next stage when the US also starts engaging in direct talks in 2018. Again, in 2019, the deal is almost done, except that Trump throws a tantrum and it gets postponed to February 2020. The moment that deal comes out, it is quite clear it is not a peace agreement. It is a withdrawal agreement in return for safe passage. And yet, if the world wants to delude itself into believing that it is a peace deal, I mean, too bad. It was not. So I think that we need to be very clear about what we are talking about. And therefore, China is, again, Pakistan and China have different positions. They have certain common interests, but I don't think there is a convergence of their strategies on Afghanistan. Thank you.
I have a direct question back to you, and then I'll go to Mariha. So you said you knew that the Taliban would come back, and you probably told this people, and it was obvious where this was going. Was India prepared for this scenario, or was this a scenario that one couldn't prepare?
Well, as I mentioned to you earlier, India chose to, I think that India chose to follow a wrong policy because India continued to think, for some odd reason, that it was not worthwhile engaging with the Taliban. And we continued to, that's why you remember in my first comment, I said that we were the only country that actually stated Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process and actually meant it. I mean, the others, from the US to the Europeans to the Russians to everybody kept saying, we are committed to an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process. And in the end, I mean, the process was, the Doha was not neither Afghan-led nor Afghan-owned. I mean, let's be clear about it. So that is what I mean by, self-delusion. As you know, there's this common saying that says that you can wake up somebody who's asleep, but you can't wake up somebody who's pretending to be asleep.
That is true. That is true. The question is, are you prepared for the wake up? And now we come to Mariha. There was a question actually in the Q&A that I would like to take up because it plays directly to the dilemma that you mentioned, and I'm sure you also want to get back at some other points. So the question is from Alessandro Ceregato, and he asks if the unfreezing of the mentioned 9.5 billion US dollar is essential, as you said, to avert a humanitarian catastrophe, since the humanitarian channels and funds are not sufficient for the purpose. Does that mean that the failure to release these funds could actually be seen as a violation of the principle of humanitarian exception, humanitarian priority, basically politicizing humanitarian aid? Is my addition. If this is the case, or if you agree with that statement, how is that perceived in Washington? Is that something people bother to think about, or is it one of many, many problems. And then from the Facebook chat, we have the question why Pakistan is not sanctioned for supporting the Taliban. I'm just the messenger of this, and you can tell us whether that ship has sailed or whether that is actually something that you would see as still relevant in our discussions. And before I'm giving you the floor, I'm just saying hello to Amin, who has now joined us and who we'll be inviting to the panel in a few minutes. But now, Madiha, over to you.
Thanks, Magdalena, for those questions. On Washington's view, I think it has not been sort of publicly acknowledged in Washington yet that humanitarian aid is not enough, essentially, to stave off this catastrophe. I think the clearest articulation we have seen of Washington's policy currently towards Afghanistan and towards the Taliban is what Tom West, who's the special representative for Afghanistan, who succeeded Zalmay Khalilzad, put forth in sort of a series of tweets saying basically we'll engage, but essentially the Taliban has to make these concessions that we expect on women's rights, on human rights, and until it does so, we're not going to unfreeze assets. I mean, didn't say it quite in the same terms, but essentially that was the message. And so that essentially says that the US is sticking by its earlier sort of promise to hold the Taliban accountable for these, issues of rights, and that, basically aid and sanctions and the freezing of assets would be the tools that the US uses. And so the US is sticking by that. I don't think there has been a public discussion or acknowledgement in Washington of the consensus now that human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations and an increasing sort of array of scholars also are reaching that humanitarian aid is not going to be enough, nor can it be delivered fast enough. I think the problem is that with sanctions in place, it's hard to deliver, the kind of humanitarian aid that we want to in the amounts that we want to, or that Afghanistan needs without running afoul of sanctions. So people are worried, right? So organizations are worried about that. And I think the other thing that organizations are running into as a problem is the fact that the banking sector basically doesn't allow you to withdraw money, right? Those of you, I'm sure in Afghanistan, can tell us more about how that is affecting the day-to-day lives of people. But essentially, if there are limits on withdrawing, then how are you actually getting the money onto the ground? There are very basic logistical problems that are having to be dealt with that there isn't yet a public discussion in Washington about. It may change. I think there's a clamor, an increasing clamor from humanitarian circles that the view on this needs to change, but I don't think the discussion is not being had in Congress, shall I say, or very publicly acknowledged by perhaps the White House or by state. I guess you had other questions. I think let me say this about U.S. policy towards Pakistan in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because of the two things I mentioned, the mood in Congress and congressional hearings towards Pakistan was pretty grim. We saw in sort of September and October, and sort of these congressional hearings that were occurring after the withdrawal, basically saying, what has gone wrong? What went wrong in the last 20 years? Why are we where we are? Why has the Taliban taken over? The mood was grim, but I will say that the Biden administration has imperatives. And those are essentially twofold. The major one is counterterrorism. And the Biden administration had assured both Congress as well as sort of the public that we don't need a presence in Afghanistan to have counterterrorism options there. Over the horizon counterterrorism is the option. Now, over the horizon counterterrorism options are limited for the Biden administration when it comes to Afghanistan, because the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan are not really an option. Given sort of Russia's stance on this. Iran isn't an option. So flights, if they're drones, essentially, intelligence operations, they kind of have to fly over Pakistan. And so the airlines of control become critical. And, there's reporting about towards, I guess it was the end of October now, that said, the US is nearing a deal with Pakistan on ALOCs, the airlines of control. And so I think that is a key concern when the US looks at how to engage Pakistan. And that will define, in some ways, the Biden administration's relationship with Pakistan. And then I think the other thing is that while Pakistan is asking the world to engage with the Taliban, it has held back on recognition, and it at least is ostensibly asking the Taliban to form a more inclusive government. Now, whether that has any effect on the Taliban, whether the Taliban wants to listen, it's unclear. An emboldened Taliban is going to be less likely to listen to Pakistan now than it was even a little bit back. And so, at least on those counts, Pakistan is doing in some ways what the US is saying, right? With the Troika Plus, with not recognizing the Taliban. So that's another factor. One last thing that I think hasn't been mentioned that I just want to quickly mention is ISIS-K. And for the Taliban, the importance of, the fact that it does not want to see defections of its own foot soldiers to ISIS-K. So one is the threat from ISIS-K, which I think everybody recognizes as a threat. The whole region does, the US does, and the Taliban does. But I think the threat of ISIS-K basically means that the Taliban is loath to make concessions that might get its more radical or most radical foot soldiers to jump ship to ISIS-K. And if that happens, then ISIS-K becomes even more emboldened. So the Taliban is sort of having to deal with, trying to maintain internal cohesion at the same time as it has obviously these external pressures. And the indications so far are that it is not really giving in to any kind of concessions because for it, internal cohesion is paramount.
Thank you, Mariha. I have now on the list our host, Tamim Asay, and then I would hand over to Amin Khan. Tamim, before giving you the floor, I'll also pass on a question to you that was indicated in the beginning when we started talking about China by Ambassador Sood. And that's the question whether, well, the Chinese policy is without close, like a lot of announcements, but the substance of investments, of engagement, even just, well, pictures with the humanitarian aid deliveries, there is a lot of skepticism. Do you share that? Do you think it will get more substantial? So what's your take on this? But also, of course, feel free to make your initial comments as well.
Well, thank you. I wouldn't be taking a lot of time because I really would like to hear from Amin Khan, and thank her for joining us. Two quick things. The first thing is there's a feeling, and there are also lots of evidence for it, that essentially Imran Khan is the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Qureshi is the Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, and the Finance Minister of Pakistan, the Finance Minister of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan has turned into this proxy state for Pakistan. And if we take it one level up, there's even talk that we Bangladesh in a way that Bangladesh did not have a border with Pakistan, but then Pakistan have found in Afghanistan in the form of Bangladesh now with their proxy in charge. Now that could be too far-fetched, but that there is a lot of Afghans feel, including Hamid Karzai, which he raised at the beginning of Taliban's rule, that Pakistan should not be speaking for Afghanistan, that we are a sovereign nation, and that we have our foreign minister. The irony is that the chief minister of Afghanistan, the chief of the act, that if you translate the Rais al-Wazara, it literally means chief minister. The chief minister of Afghanistan never talks. The foreign minister of Afghanistan is busy between Doha and Qatar, Doha and Islamabad. And then there is nobody else talking there. while the intentions of Prime Minister Khan, as well as Qureshi and others, the 3-4 times visits of the DGISI, and one was very famous before the formation of the cabinet, and then the entire fiasco over the appointment of the new ISI chief and Imran Khan, keeping the good old general trying to keep him in position, created a lot of stir in Afghanistan and the region. That is essentially Pakistan doing all the bidding and managing the internal affairs of Afghanistan. If you see Pakistan ambassador, he's hosting within Pakistani ambassador all the cabinet ministers of Afghanistan, the Taliban cabinet ministers. A lot of people feel that he's now the viceroy of Afghanistan, given that the plethora of Taliban ministers and the visits that's happening. Now, we know the criticality of Pakistan because of the importance that it has, because of its relationship with Taliban, because of its influence, and because a lot of people depend on Pakistan for safe passage, for delivering humanitarian aid. All those good intentions are there. But whether deliberately or undeliberately that particular messaging and image building is happening, I think that has to be either rectified or by the Pakistani authorities, or there has to be more proactiveness by the Taliban government, emirate, on some of these things. I mean, today, Imran Khan mentioned just an hour ago, maybe 3 hours ago, that he was briefed by the intelligence people that there will be a civil war, and Afghans are very lucky that there is no civil war and there's Taliban in charge. And nobody can say that for sure, because you don't know next year you will have a civil war. It's just a matter of time. So, and I'm not advocating civil war at all. I'm just saying that it's too early to make that shot, given that they're 5th month into that. On China, again, a lot of experience, not a lot of experience, but yes, maybe a lot of experience, a lot of back and forth visiting Beijing, and dealing with them in different capacities that I was. There's a lot of talk, there's no work. There's a lot of cheap PR that they get. They don't have much to show. I mean, if you combine the entire Chinese aid for the last 20 years, it's $380 million. A lot of them are in kind. There's not even one USAID project. The entire plethora of it. I don't think Chinese are serious about Afghanistan. They think it's a trap. They only, what Madiha mentioned, and I fully echo that, they have two concerns. Make sure it doesn't pose a threat to CPEC, and it's not used as a staging ground to destabilize Xinjiang or the corridor that goes through Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Tamim. I would now invite Ms. Amina Khan from the International Strategic Studies Institute in Islamabad. The reason why Ms. Khan is a bit late is that she attended a really interesting conference, and I would like to ask just to share maybe a few insights on, because when I saw it, it's the Afghanistan Road to Durable Peace. And I think we have heard from Ambassador Sood already some half-flattering remarks about the peace process that we had in the past month. And since August 15th, it's basically a story of the past. And even also in the policy briefs, everybody's trying to look forward. And the peace process is basically maybe not mentioned, and certainly the US have dropped the ball here a little. So, Amina, obviously the floor is yours now, also for remarks on our topic. But if you could share a bit, what is the current discussion in the region about peace in Afghanistan? What is the understanding? Is it making peace with the Taliban, or are we talking about really a hope for a societal, like a rich peace?
First of all, yes, thank you for having me. And again, my apologies. I got the times wrong, and I had to attend to this session that we were having on Afghanistan, where we did have speakers from the US, as well as an Afghan speaker. And of course, we had a regional perspective from Dr. Barakat. And I think by and large, the consensus was that, the situation is extremely fragile, it's complex, but that engagement is necessary. However, there are limitations, particularly within the US, on exactly how to engage with the Taliban. And I think points were raised that this was a bit contradictory, where the US is not willing to recognize the Taliban, but yet at the same time, it was the US that in fact allowed the Taliban to come into power, and it was done through a process. It wasn't done through isolation. But I think it was very diverse, and the recording is available on our YouTube channel. So maybe then anybody who's interested can view it from there. Unfortunately, I have missed what other speakers have said. So forgive me if I do repeat some things. Can you just tell me how long I have?
We have 10 minutes in total. So if you take 4, then we have like 6 minutes to.
Right. Okay. I will try to quickly brush through. And of course, this is going to be a repetition of what I did say upstairs. But look, the situation in Afghanistan, it is extremely. I mean, it's at a very critical juncture. And while yes, there was this anticipation that in the absence of a negotiated settlement, a military takeover by the Taliban in essence was expected, but I think the manner and the speed at which the group did take over was certainly not anticipated, and not even by Pakistan, despite its relationship with the group. Now, the situation has certainly left a number of questions unanswered, primarily on how the group is going to govern the country domestically in terms of governance, political freedom, women's rights, what their role in essence means for regional peace and stability. But I think more importantly, whether the country will be able to deliver on their counterterrorism assurances, because I think that is the most important aspect that will determine the future of the government. Because while yes, the international community and regional countries do talk about human rights, women's rights, which are important, as is a government that is representative, by and large, I think if the Taliban are able to ensure that Afghanistan does not pose a security threat to regional countries, I think they'll be, willing to overlook for a certain period of time these aspects. And, as harsh as it sounds, this is reality. But of course, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And we have seen that while the Taliban has displayed certain changes within the group, certainly they've learned the art of diplomacy. They're engaging with countries that one didn't even envisage them engaging with, primarily Iran and Moscow, to give you an example. The ideology does remain the same, and I think this is something that will continue to focus on. Now, in essence, the real test for the group has begun. And as I said, this is not confined to just capturing power. I think it's going to be more about legitimacy, certainly recognition, which the group is looking for, and of course, how the group performs. Because now the Taliban have been given a chance, the expectations or the bar of the expectations that even the common Afghan expects from the Taliban is very, very high. And considering the institutions that the Taliban have inherited, which are extremely weak, divided, fragile, the fact that they don't have any means of monetary means, it is a tall task and an order for the Taliban. And of course, we're going to see whether they can deliver. They are trying to consolidate their power, but they're struggling. And I think it's a work in progress to summarize that. And with every passing day, we are seeing that the country is inching towards a humanitarian crisis. And while we have seen the provision of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan by regional countries, it is reassuring. However, it is not enough, and it will not be enough to sustain the Afghan population, because humanitarian aid is one thing, and providing economic assistance to start the functioning of the government is another thing. And there is a big issue, because as discussed in our session, the international community is reluctant to provide economic assistance to the Taliban. And again, I think that's contradictory, since they came in through a process. Now, again, as I said, no country has recognized the Taliban, but we've seen the international community is engaging directly with the Taliban through Doha, whereas regional countries have a direct, policy of engagement. And again, this is not just limited to Pakistan. The Iranians, the Russians, the Central Asians, and of course the Chinese are extensively engaging with the Taliban. Again, the country is suffering, from issues of governance, weak institutions. And I think this is a major issue of concern for regional countries. And I think the major, issue for us, and I will say Pakistan, is that look at the Taliban. Is there another alternative to the Taliban? Number one. And number two, if the Taliban are not able to consolidate their position and ensure some semblance of stability. The fear is not so much of a civil war, but I think of rather transnational terrorist groups, taking advantage of the situation and filling the vacuum. And for us, primarily, it is the ISKP, Islamic State of Khorasan Province, or the TTP. And for that matter, even for other regional countries like the ETIM, the IMU, the Chechens and whatnot. So I think, and I think this sentiment, by the way, has been echoed by the Special Rep for Afghanistan, Ms. Deborah Lyons, who said that, Afghanistan's collapsing economy is in fact, heightening the risk of extremism. So I think this is important. And again, I think this is the biggest threat to Afghanistan, which is certainly domestic, such as the economy and humanitarian crisis, but equally that Afghanistan will, fall prey to these transnational groups. Therefore, I think engagement is necessary. And, let us not forget the Taliban, again, I will say this, and it's so important, and I think it was even overlooked by our international speakers who tend to just ignore this aspect. The Taliban came in through a process, which is the Doha Agreement, good or bad. Yes, it's debatable how good it was, how constructive it was, but, and it was a process. Moreover, the premise of the agreement was that, Al-Qaeda had been defeated and the Taliban had given an assurance that they would not entertain any terrorist group, or for that matter, Al-Qaeda. But if you're refusing to engage with the group and deny, much needed economic assistance, and by freezing assets, how does the international community, or for that matter, even the region, expect the Taliban to perform and deny space to such elements? These are important questions that need to be viewed through a much broader lens and not limited to politics, which I know is easier said than done because there are domestic limitations within every country. Now, let me quickly touch upon, the region. Yes, regional countries, certainly we've seen, they've come to the forefront to play a more prominent role in Afghanistan. And despite the previous differences and divergences, we have seen Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, and the Central Asians appearing to be on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan, which primarily does revolve around engaging with the Taliban, calling for an inclusive political setup, and focusing on a humanitarian crisis, as well as curbing, transnational elements, as well as the illegal movement of drugs and arms, and of course, ensuring that the group does deliver on its pledges of reform. Now, while there is this somewhat, there's this strange strategic coincidence, maybe we could refer to it as that, there is still a debate on which regional country could play the role of that maybe, credible regional interlocutor. And I think time and again, even in the session that I just attended, Pakistan's name came up again and again. But I think, because of the historical baggage Pakistan has, I think Pakistan should continue to follow the policy that it is currently following, which is being, guided by a regional approach. Now, a lot has always been said about Pakistan, and I think that is not surprising, simply because Pakistan, let's be very honest, has always been the convenient scapegoat. Now, I understand Pakistan's policies in the past have certainly been contradictory and vague at times, but let's keep one thing in mind. From day one, Pakistan has been saying that there has to be engagement with the Taliban, and there can be, military solution. There has to be a negotiated settlement. And it's unfortunate that it's just taken, more than 2 decades for the international community to realize this. Now, it is also important to realize that having a relationship is one thing and leverage is completely another facet of a relationship. Please understand that the Taliban, they've learned, as I said, the art of diplomacy. They have been extensively engaging with, international and extra-regional, countries, and they have somewhat gained de facto recognition. Moreover, the group has many other sources of, support. So I think it's a bit naive, if I may say, to, put the onus of the future of Afghanistan on Pakistan solely. Since the Taliban's takeover, and this is something that I, firmly support, Pakistan's policy towards the group has been guided by a regional approach. Time and again, Pakistan has been talking about a more representative government, of course, counterterrorism assurances, and ensuring that, women and human rights are adhered to and respected. Pakistan has has a relationship with the Taliban, but then so do other countries. Pakistan shouldn't be shy or apologetic of its relationship with the Taliban, but then at the same time, Pakistan does not need to be an advocate of the group. And I think the current policy, as I said, that we're following, which is based on the regional consensus, is I think the right way forward. However, at the same time, it is unfortunate, but during the past 2 decades, the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan, has been entangled in this vicious, and it's been very limited to the lens, or rather the peace process. And as a result, other important areas of the bilateral relationship have greatly suffered, or either haven't even been touched upon. Now, India has signed a strategic agreement with, Afghanistan, so has Iran, and Pakistan still does not have that. And I find that a bit strange, considering the fact that these two countries are so dependent on each other, particularly the common man, and that it's unfortunate that nothing prospered between the two countries in the past. It is important for Pakistan now to move away from the security lens and focus on other areas of the bilateral relationship, which is primarily trade, of course, talking about the border, and of course, issues that are, as I said, ignored, such as a water sharing agreement, which we do not have with Afghanistan. And I think the APAPS is a good place to start from, but I think it needs to be expanded and focused on. So in the end, I would just say that Afghanistan must be viewed not as a regional issue, but as a collective and a shared responsibility. And one hopes that better sense prevails amongst the Taliban, where focus is on a more representative government, which is certainly inclusive, which is responsible and accountable. And I think it is very important for the group to realize that if they do not deliver on their pledges of reform, they will not get the support they so badly need to survive. And I think that support is more from regional countries and less from the international community, because I think the Taliban did anticipate that there would be reluctance from the international community. Therefore, one hopes that the Taliban will deliver. And I think one way of doing that is by engaging with the group, because I think engagement will provide somewhat leverage over the Taliban. But at the same time, I think it needs to be understood that the Taliban are, a separate entity, and then cannot be dictated upon. And I think this is important to keep in mind. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amin. And also thank you for, joining us despite your other commitments. And I think for not with much, actually, replications, summing up quite, I think, a couple of points that we had in the beginning, which gives me the actual honor to almost close almost on time. We're a bit ahead, and I know that viewers and panelists have other obligations and commitments they need to attend. So I will wrap up here, but not without thanking everyone and give you maybe a bit of a conclusion, but more or less where I think we want to go further, and where I think FES, but also IWPS can support and maybe even close some of the gaps. I think what we heard from our speakers and also what we see in the policy briefs, and that you will see published on our website, on IWS website, there's a heavy focus on the Taliban's engagement with the international world, and it's very much focused on government-to-government relations. We talked about security, we talked about counterterrorism, we talked about recognition. Obviously, the Afghan people play a role. They were also referred, but more as maybe a bit even bystanders of this whole discussion, because we lost, at least for the time being, the strong muscle of the Afghan civil society in an organized way. So I think where we need to come back or continue our discussion is also, what is the future of people-to-people relations? I mean, I just mentioned, of course, economic exchange. But there was also mentioned by some of the speakers, of course, now a challenge to actually even leave Afghanistan or to export or rebuild these institutions that were mentioned that are so fragile right now. So I think that is something where we will continue to have a look. How can actually the Indian and the Afghan societies can build on their long relationships? How can we rebuild trust? And we heard this from comments on Facebook, but also in our panel ourselves. There is a trust deficit, let's say it like this, between segments of the Pakistani and the Afghan society that need to be overcome to actually move forward. So I think that's one of my takeaways from this session. I can encourage all to read the papers, to comment on them, let us know. Also follow our speakers who have also written and published extensively in very exciting papers and comments on the future of engagement. Stay engaged with us, with FES and with IWPS. Support IWPS and other Afghan organizations wherever you can. I think it's important that we keep and support these voices that will help us to overcome isolation. With this, everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, get vaccinated, and join us at the next occasion. We're very thankful for your engagement. Have a good afternoon, good evening, and have a great start in your day wherever you are. Thank you very much.